Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros,
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
and today we're going to be talking about Aristippus, who was a ancient Greek philosopher, and one could say is the hedonist philosopher. So if you think about hedonists in ancient Greece, if you are at all familiar, you'll probably think about the Epicureans, but Aristippus actually came before Epicurus, and in some ways fits the caricature of the hedonist better than the Epicureans. If you think about lavish lifestyle, fine foods, parties, women, and such, Aristippus is a little bit closer to that description. So we thought it'd be fun to talk about him, as he's one of the influential ancient Greek philosophers, thinkers. You see many others interact with him at his school as well. So that's what we'll do today.
Yeah, there's this reoccurring. I think there's this reoccurring adjectivization. I don't know if that's a word, but you get skeptic, cynic, stoic. We use those adjectives in modern language, and then there's this thing when you learn about Epicureanism, you say, well, they're hedonists and that they think pleasure is the good, but they're not the hedonists the way we talk about hedonism in modern language. They're kind of they want their carrots and potatoes and they want the garden. That's the Epicureans, where Aristippus, he's maybe more of that, as you said, more of that traditional hedonist as we would think about today, or modern hedonist, I guess, really going all in on the pleasure, not letting things stop the pursuit of pleasure. And he'll critique other philosophers, as we'll see, for their inability to achieve the pleasure. Really point to that as weakness on their part, not a quality or a strength. Another reason that he's a fun person to talk about is he's kind of I would say a bit of a deep cut, at least when I talk about Hellenistic philosophy, always kind of put the big three schools as the skeptics, the Stoics, and the Epicureans, and then maybe the Cynics get in there. And he was the founder of the Cyrenaic school of philosophy, which I don't know if we've talked about at all on this podcast, Caleb. Maybe a little bit, but more of a deep cut. Which is fun and interesting, a nice new contrast to those other established schools.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. I don't think we've ever talked about the Cyrenaics school before, though I do know a handful of guests have mentioned the school. So we'll talk about maybe start with some biographical details, and then we'll jump into some anecdotes from his life and his philosophy. I think he's one of the characters who is best understood perhaps through anecdote, aphorisms, short interactions, and such. Just some basic biographical facts then. Aristippus was a student of Socrates, though he had serious disagreements with Socrates. He lived from 435 to 356 BCE. As you said, he was the founder of the Cyrenaic school of philosophy, and we'll go into detail what that was. And one of the main sources we have about him is Diogenes Laertius. So we've talked about Diogenes before. This is not Diogenes the Cynic, but a rather third century writer, philosopher, and type. And his most well-known work is the lives and opinions of eminent philosophers, and that's one of the main sources for Greek philosophy, Greek philosophers, especially when it comes to sort of these catalogs of different philosophers. So, for example, he has many of the ancient Stoics in this book, such as Zeno, and it goes through a biography of many philosophers as well as their life. So that's one of the main sources we have for Aristippus, though he's mentioned by name by a number of other sources, often critical.
Yeah. Major Diogenes, as you were saying, major source for because we don't really have much from Zeno, Cleanthes, Chrysippus, but we get this view of their life and their thinking and the books that they wrote that we lost from Diogenes. So he's a cool source of that. And then that other part you're probably picking up just that a real contemporary of Plato's then, right? Plato was
Mhm.
a student of Socrates, very important philosopher. And Aristippus would have then been a contemporary around the same age, maybe a bit older, a bit younger. I'm not exactly I'm not exactly sure of Plato's birth date off the top of my head, but a real contemporary of Plato, not somebody kind of looking up to him. And we'll see that in these anecdotes when they kind of debate and engage with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, like uh, some other philosophers, it's best to get a sense of who Aristippus was through a handful of anecdotes. So we'll go through a few of those. Let's start with a the following. So I'll just read from Diogenes Laertius. I'll read a handful of these quips. When Dionysus inquired what was the reason that philosophers go to rich men's houses while rich men no longer visit philosophers, his reply was, and here his is Aristippus, the one know what they need while the other do not. And crucially, there, Dionysus is Dionysus the tyrant from Syracuse. He comes up again and again because Aristippus ended up at his court after he was a follower of Socrates. Another one. When he was reproached by Plato for his extravagance, he inquired, "Do you think Dionysus a good man?" And the reply being in the affirmative, "And yet," said he lives more extravagantly than I do. So there's nothing to hinder a man living extravagantly and well. To the question of how the educated differ from the uneducated, he replied, "Exactly as horses that have been trained differ from untrained horses." And one day, as he entered the house of a courtesan, one of the lads with him blushed, whereupon he remarked, "It is not the going in that is dangerous, but being unable to go out." So,
Yeah, great.
yeah, there's a handful. What's your take?
I mean, they're all this. I mean, except for the training horses one, they're all these really justifications. People are so Aristippus is living extravagantly. He's doing all these kind of fancy, he's going and whining and dining with rich people. He's hanging out with the socially elites, um, and he's getting kind of criticized for this. There's this almost, I would say, reading this biography from Diogenes, there's almost this perception that this is not appropriate for a philosopher. And maybe a philosopher needs to have the leisure time, needs to be upper middle class, something like this. But to be really rich, to be really extravagant, it wasn't appropriate for a philosopher. Maybe it showed that you were valuing not the life of the mind, but the life of the material goods. And Aristippus is basically being like, it's okay if I want nice things. And there's nothing wrong with living extravagantly as long as you don't become a bad person. Really, almost taking this stoic preferred indifferent line. I mean, it's not a preferred indifferent line because he thinks these things are just good,
Mm-hmm.
but he's saying, look, as long as it doesn't corrupt you, why can't I go and live extravagantly? And same kind of thing with being promiscuous and sleeping with women, which is to say, this is fine. It's just, don't let it corrupt you, right? Like, don't let it go too far. So there's almost this position of throwing the baby out with the bathwater is almost Aristippus' position around pleasure and extravagance. Which you say, well, you've got something good here, you've got something corrupting. You're all getting, can't handle the good thing because you're letting it corrupt you. But if you just like stay a good person, I'm going to go and I'm going to hang out with rich people. I'm going to sleep with women. I'm going to live extravagantly, and that's I'm better off for it.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right that there's this. Most philosophers did not orient their philosophy of life around the pursuit of pleasure, and
Mm-hmm.
whether that meant in food, drink, women, riches, and such. You think about Plato certainly doesn't do that, whereas Aristippus sort of honestly, in a obvious way, pursues such things and has no problem, say, receiving money for his teachings, going to be the advisor of a tyrant and such. So that's I think that's generally what he's about, really. Uh, so another quip or interaction from another famous philosopher is he bumps into Diogenes the cynic this time. Diogenes, washing the dirt from his vegetables, saw him passing and jeered at him in these terms: "If you had learnt to make these your diet, you would not have paid court to kings." To which his rejoinder was, "And if you knew how to associate with men, you would not be washing vegetables."
I mean, this is one of my favorites. Like, it's, I mean, it's not often people get a one up on Diogenes the Cynic. Um, but that's just, he's just saying, I really do respect the position, at least when it's consistent and it's clear. Aristippus is saying, look, if I can stay a good person and have nice things, it's clearly better than you, Diogenes, who claims to be a good person and eats vegetables. Like that seems to me to be, you're eating vegetables and maintaining your virtue because you don't know how to maintain your virtue and associate with men, how to hang out with kings at the same time. I can
Mhm.
do that. So like, sucks to suck basically is his counter argument. And it's obviously not a stoic position fully. I mean, maybe that quip might be not necessarily contradictory to stoicism, but I respect the consistency of it, because I think a lot of the times what upsets people is the kind of hypocrisy. Even
Sure.
if you think of a sophist, like what's annoying about a sophist is, I think, the hypocrisy in sophism, where it seems like they're selling wisdom, but they're really selling persuasion or the appearance of wisdom. They're not explicit about, like, I'm just selling the appearance of wisdom and I'm just making money from that, and that's my job. Um, Whereas, so people think they want to catch the philosopher in this kind of hypocrisy, which is like, you claim to be committed to the life of the mind. I would think that would look like somebody like a Diogenes. Diogenes is the honest man who says the life of the mind involves eating vegetables and sleeping in a barrel. You're all, Plato, you're living pretty well, you're a hypocrite. Aristippus, you're living well, you're a hypocrite. And Aristippus is like, whoa, no, like, this is not against my philosophy. I like nice things. I'm going to enjoy nice things, and I'm going to not let them corrupt me. I'm not going to let that, because Aristippus is not blind to the fact, because any sort of intelligent hedonist
Mhm.
position has to acknowledge the fact that sometimes the pursuit of material wealth leads to unhappy lives, right? Like, there's not,
Yeah.
no coherent hedonist is going to say pursue wealth and pleasure at all costs. They're going to say, obviously, in some cases, the pursuit of wealth and pleasure leads to unhappiness, and that's a bad life, even for the gluttonist, critical, the hedonist that we criticize, right? They say, well, I don't want that life because that's one of more suffering. So this is this kind of intelligent hedonism, which is to say, well, you don't pursue these things in a way that makes you unhappy. You don't pursue these things in a way that, uh, I'm presuming, makes you a bad person, such that you become unhappy, you become hated, you become a pariah, you become filled with regret. But pursue these things as much as possible, insofar as you're able to, and insofar as they don't make you unhappy, which he's saying is a lot more than eating vegetables, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's captured nicely with the quip that he had with the lad entering the house of a Cartesian, right? It's not the entering that's dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
but being unable to leave, unable to go out. That's the risk, which shows that basic point about self mastery. It's important to, as you were saying, any intelligent hedonist is going to say it's important to master yourself so that you can experience the positive of pleasure without succumbing to its downside.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that I also love about this encounter with Diogenes is that it brings out the two men's value of the value they place on autonomy, but how it's cashes out very differently for the two of them. So Diogenes says you wouldn't have to pay court to kings, if you had learned how to eat vegetables. If you learned basically, if you learned to reject nonsense pleasures, you wouldn't have to get on your hands and knees and grovel in these high courts to make money to sustain your lifestyle, right? And that's coming from the man who snubbed his nose at Alexander, who has no problem, he has no interest in paying court to
Mm-hmm.
kings. He's purely interested in living autonomously, living what he sees as the free life, free from useless social convention. Whereas, of course, Aristippus' reply is just that, look, if you knew how to associate well with men, you wouldn't find yourself enslaved by all these kinds of social interactions. I simply need money to sustain my lifestyle, so I'm going to do what's required to to get it. And that's that. That's all there is to it. There's another line he has about being asked what he had gained from philosophy, so the line goes as follows: being asked what he had gained from philosophy, he replied, "The ability to feel at ease in any society," which brings out a kind of similar ideas around self mastery and
Mhm.
the importance of being able to experience pleasure in a range of different circumstances, in a range of different groups of people and such.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've done an episode on risk aversion in Stoicism. We've done an episode on Diogenes as well, but it's making me think of this idea that the Diogenes position, which is essentially the Stoic position, is like better to never want to eat lobster and cake than to have one moment where you want those things and you can't have them and you suffer because of that. It's almost like this like never fail, never err.
Mhm.
And I almost take Aristippus' position to be like, well, better to eat cake and lobster 99 times and have one time, where maybe I can't. Like, I'll accept that risk if it means I get to do these things that no, Diogenes, you don't have the social skills to be able to do. Um, I mean, I think that's what you were saying that's what I was taking you to say about cashing out the autonomy. It's like Diogenes protects his autonomy by never feeling unable to do something he wants to do. That's the Stoic position, right? Never placing desire in something outside of what's up to you. And Aristippus exerts his autonomy basically by gaining power, by having the ability to do impressive, successful things, by being socially adept, by making powerful friends, by having money. The Stoics have these arguments against this kind of autonomy, or against this, I guess, placing too much weight in this, or placing, the ultimate ends in that kind of pursuit, and the
Mhm.
dangers there. But it is nice to see someone so unabashedly take that position, and not admire Diogenes and not seem like a sucker, or not seem like they're missing the point. I think when a lot of people criticize Diogenes, they go ew, or they go that's weird, and I
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
don't really listen to those criticisms. But that's, I feel like, this is a follower of Socrates looking at Diogenes and is like, yeah, I'm just choosing not to be you. Like, I think you've picked the worst life, Diogenes. Um, which is, I don't know, it's like a really anti-Stoic position. I think it's kind of cool.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. Aristippus is challenging the Stoics and saying, when you think of people who are invested in the external, maybe you think of like the obsessive person, or the person who burns the ship so that they can force themselves to achieve all the success they want, and puts in hours and hours of attempting to mold the world in accordance with their will or what have you. And maybe even many societies that worship approve of that kind of life. People who have those kinds of profiles sometimes seem to get a lot done and such. um, and Stoics rightly point out that those people are in some ways just enslaved by the external world. They've tied themselves up,
Mhm.
their own well-being, to wanting a certain kind of outcome, whether that's business success, artistic success, um, simply the desires, strong desires for powerful desires for pleasure. And Aristippus challenges that and says, look, you don't need to go completely the direction of the Cynics or the Stoics. You can be the kind of person who rushes after pleasure without experiencing the pain of losing it. Just a simple, pragmatic life where you pursue pleasure in a disciplined and playful way. There's a nice story of here where he has a slave who feels like they have too much stuff and they're on a trip or something like this. And Aristippus says, so just toss out some of the money, basically, just toss out a bunch of the coins, which perhaps illustrates this point that Aristippus is really after pleasure, not money, not other social ideas of
Mm.
convention and many things like money. They're purely instrumental, and he's not investing himself in a certain outcome like perhaps many obsessive types are. So that's, I think, that one of the key challenges I see that he's offering the Stoics.
Yeah, that's cool. That's a really great point. Well, I mean, it almost becomes like what traps you, as you said, is that that focus on, it almost becomes obstacles the way is what I'm thinking, right? Is
Yeah.
like, it's like what traps you is if you associate pleasure with a specific external outcome, like acquiring wealth. That's what traps you. That's what makes you go, if Dionysius turns out to be not a good guy, that's what traps you in the court. But if you're the kind of person who's able to go to that court and then also throw out all your money, because that becomes the path of the least amount of suffering and the most pleasure. I don't know. It gets around a lot of those concerns around externals we were talking about. It seems like you are focusing on something up to you. It's not virtue, but it is something up to you, which is, how do I maximize my pleasure in each situation, which might involve, in this case, not wanting things that are not up to me, or getting rid of my money if that's what the situation calls for. That's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. It's in some ways it's not that far away from Seneca. It's almost a version of
Hmm.
Seneca without the social duties, perhaps.
Yeah.
Where if Seneca has different lines to the effect of it's not owning silver spoons that does you in. It's the fact that they own you. And also, I think you get the sense that Seneca enjoyed many of the fine experiences in life, and he loves to quote Epicurus, perhaps for some non-Stoic reasons. But that's
Yeah.
in a way, Aristippus isn't too far away from that.
Yeah. Seneca had a lot of silver spoons.
Yeah.
He was writing this silver spoon line while looking at all of his silver spoons, trying to justify them.
Cool. Are there any quips or lines you wanted to call out?
Um, Let me take a second. Yeah, so there were, so here's another quip from Aristippus that I want to call out because, you know, you lay all these things out and then it can kind of sound like, well, guy is just a kind of funny rich guy. He's kind of a, I don't know, I haven't read a lot of Oscar Wilde, but some rich guy making quips. Where's the philosophy to this? Um, there's a story here, which is when someone brought his son as a pupil, Aristippus asked the fee of 500 drachmae. The father objected. For that sum, I can buy a slave. Then do so, was the reply, and you will have two. And that is just pure Socrates, right? Without philosophy, you are a slave. So there is almost this. I guess I don't want to give him too much of a hard time as a hedonist. There's almost this sense of hedonism is this state you can achieve after the pursuit of philosophy, right? Going back to his, there was another one, there was another passage in Diogenes, which was like, why did you spend the first half of your life with Socrates and the second half of your life with Dionysius? And
Hmm.
he's basically saying, well, one was for philosophy and the other was for pleasure. They're for different purposes. I basically achieved my education and I was able to move on to the next stage. So there is this kind of conception of, young men need an education, young people need education, they need philosophy, they need to study, they need to understand these things. As you talked about, self mastery. And then once you have self mastery, you can go and you can do these things he does, because he has a degree of self control. It's not a kind of position he's advocating for 18-year-olds. He thinks the 18-year-old is a slave. And again, that's a very stoic kind of metaphor. That's something Epictetus would use. He's calling the son of a rich man a slave. That's a very provocative thing. It's like, well, it's metaphorical, and it's metaphorical that the boy is a slave to his desires. Presumably, he's a slave to his ignorance, and so it's that same kind of Socratic role of first you acquire your education, then you only then you become self-mastered, and then you can do that to pursue the life of hedonism. It's not just this like wake up and you're 18-year-old, do whatever you want kind of thing.
Yeah, you do see that common emphasis on education throughout the Greek schools, and yeah, the Cyrenaics are no exception. Perhaps there's fundamentally important to practice philosophy, and that's something that one needs to develop over time. As well as that focus on not being a slave. Stoics have that picture of what's required for freedom. Socrates does as well, of course. Diogenes, as we spoke, Diogenes the Cynic. So I'll just read a few more quips, then we can get into some of the doctrines, if you will. So just I think it's a really a fun chapter if you get a chance to go through this chapter on Aristippus. There's just the beginning is a whole list of these, but just to get more of a sense of the man. It happened once that he set for Corinth, and being overtaken by a storm, he was in great consternation. Someone said, "We plain men are not alarmed, and are you philosophers turned to cowards?" To this he replied, "The lives at stake in the two cases are not comparable." When someone gave himself airs for wide learning, this is what he said: "As those who eat most and take the most exercise are not better in health than those who restrict themselves to what they require, so too is not wide reading, but useful reading that tends to excellence." An advocate, having pleaded for him and won the case, thereupon put the question, "What good did Socrates do you?" "Thus much," was the reply, "that what you said of me in your speech was true." All right, so that's just a handful of other quips stories. Let's get into the doctrine, I suppose, of the Cyrenaics. So Aristippus himself did write some works. We don't have access to any of these. One gets a sense that I think, like a few other philosopher types, the doctrines of the school were really developed by his followers from his teachings. So some of the key points in the school is that, of course, only pleasure and pain are good. And in particular, it is this focus on bodily pleasure and pain that are and these are the most intense goods or bads, not mental, not this focus on sort of the absence of pain or tranquility that the Epicureans had. So that set them apart from the other hedonist schools. And in particular, it was pleasure in the moment, pleasure accurately pursued. And you can almost think of it as a kind of disciplined, egoistic bodily hedonism. Is a bit of a clunky phrase, but that's, I think, how I would try to capture the doctrines of the school in one go.
So disciplined because to pursue it undisciplined would naturally lead to poor results, right? You have to kind of strategically pick your battles, decide what you're pursuing. Egoistic because it doesn't have the social obligations that Stoicism comes to have. It's about maximizing your personal pleasure. And then bodily because of that focus, as you said, on the body. Is that what you have in mind by that phrase?
Yeah, that's what I have in mind, because there are different hedonists, from the Epicureans to later utilitarians. They'll often focus on, one could say, more sophisticated pleasures. They'll say, people think of a hedonist, they think of wine, women, and nice things, but really what matters are the pleasures of Socrates, of the mind, or absence of pain and kind of tranquility. That's what matters. Whereas Aristippus says, no, what matters is wine, women, and nice things. Uh, that's what I had in mind.
Yeah, cool. There's some more nitty gritty. That all makes sense to me. There's some more nitty gritty differences that Epicureanism I want to call out. I mean, you called out this focus on bodily pleasure. That's really important because the Epicurean picture is going to be that there's going to be a lot of reliance on memories, a lot of reliance on reflections on positive experiences and bringing those up. And the Cyrenaics are saying no. Obviously, thinking about hanging out with friends is not the same thing as hanging out with friends. Obviously, thinking about a good meal is not the same thing as having a good meal. So there's that focus on kind of this in the moment action, which requires you to get out of the Epicureans. We've done a couple episodes on them, but they have this ideal of this kind of garden, this removal from society. Well, that's not really going to cut it to be a good Cyrenaic. You're going to have to be in some city around these like premium experiences. You're going to have to be engaging with people. Can't really isolate yourself in the same way. Another interesting thing is that the the actual definitions of pleasure and pain are different. So, the Epicureans had this argument of the ideal pleasure is actually this absence of pain or this removal of pain, which sounds strange, but you just think of, you're sitting at home, you're in a comfy environment, you're with people you like, you feel comfortable. That's kind of the Epicurean ideal. Um, but pleasure as a state of motion is actually, I'm actively eating the food. I'm actively, you know, drinking or partying or, whatever they were doing, having a good, it can still be intellectual, having a good debate with a friend, but it's that kind of in the moment excitement and action. I think that that's just going to require more risk taking than Epicurean approach entails. Um, so that was another thing, and then one other thing I wanted to call out that I thought was that I really liked about this was that external things. You gave that example of throwing the money overboard, but external things like status, freedom, wealth, you know, they don't matter except in terms of how they facilitate or prevent pleasure. And so you see Aristippus actually being kind of radical in a couple of his positions. Um, so we shouldn't deny pleasure because it's against social convention. So one way to read that criticism of Diogenes is like, oh, you've got a person who's kind of successful and they're a non-radical person making fun of the Diogenes washing vegetables, right? He's just kind of sticking his nose up at it. But this is a person who was also willing to do controversial things. There's a part in Diogenes where he talks about taking as a lover a woman who's had many partners, and he's like, well, does it matter if a ship has been rowed in before, or somebody has used a horse, or makes these kind of metaphors, which is like, no, like I obviously I shouldn't care if this person's had previous partners. That doesn't affect my experience at all unless I allow it to. There's another scene where they're kind of partying. And he's partying with Plato, and Plato refuses to put on a dress because it's too feminine. And Aristippus is like, I don't care. I'll put on the dress and be silly, and break these social conventions about what men are supposed to wear. And so that was, I think, another thing too, is it's not it is willing to be, I guess it's saying the life of most pleasure is one where you're able to socially get along most of the time, but don't allow these social conventions either to kind of limit you or restrict you. So you don't sit yourself outside the city in this Epicurean commune. You make yourself a part of the city,
Mhm.
but if you're having a good time and the party's getting crazy and somebody makes a joke about putting on a dress, you're not like, oh, I can't do that because that's not what I'm supposed to do. With these social conventions, like it's more. You use the phrase playful. That's just one specific example, but it's more just being playful within society at the same time and pushing back on it when it needs to be pushed back on, instead of something like Diogenes, which is a full rejection.
Yeah, that's a great point, a great thing to bring out. Where I the yeah, Aristippus does, he sort of lives almost like the Stoics. He lives within social conventions, but doesn't really respect it except as a pragmatic guideline.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it doesn't. One doesn't get the sense that he really cares about it any more deeply than that as a thing to navigate around or play with and such. So, and you have many different examples of that, from violating the conception of a philosopher living a wealthy lifestyle to several of the ones you mentioned as well.
So the Cyrenaic school, hedonist, but with this focus on bodily pleasure. This focus on pleasure is a state of motion, so something that actually dissipates over time. So you can't have the one good meal and sit and think about it like the Epicureans think.
Yeah.
You've got to go and you've got to keep having good meals every week, to enjoy that. So it's a bit more risk taking, a bit more playful, a bit more um, colloquially hedonist than the Epicureans. We always kind of have to caveat the Epicurean life. With the Cyrenaics, I say I don't think we have to caveat it. I think we have to caveat it with say it's not necessarily an insult, which is to say they're not going to make the short-sighted. Aristippus is not going to make the short-sighted mistake of overeating and then getting sick, because obviously that doesn't result
Mhm.
in more pleasure. He has a mastery. He's able to enter but also leave these pleasure situations. So he has this philosophical education which allows self mastery, which allows maximization of pleasure in a way that's not available to non philosophers. Is that a yeah? Does that match your conception of the school?
No, yeah, absolutely. I think that's well put. And I think one other interesting difference the Cyrenaics have that I wanted to mention here, because I think it is interesting, is that they didn't also, unlike many other ancient Greek philosophers, did not see happiness as the ultimate end of life. It was simply just pleasure and happiness, this state that sort of exists through time, what philosophers would call a dispositional property, which is just a fancy way of saying, maybe a trait of a life, is just a outgrowth of many pleasurable moments. For them, it really is pleasure in each moment, moment by moment. They're presentists, if you will. And
Yeah.
what matters is being able to practically obtain pleasure in each moment, not, say, something like Aristotle, this view where happiness, that's a property of a life and something you can truly only say at the end of one's life, whether someone lived a good life, whether they were happy. And that's what ultimately matters for humans. Aristippus, they didn't think that. It was more of a matter of moment by moment. Are you able to obtain pleasure?
Yeah, I find there. I was going to say metaphor of motion, but I think
Hmm.
they probably didn't mean it metaphorically. But pleasure as motion, it's like is there moment? Is it moving? Like I don't know what the physical example would be, but it's like is a certain chemical being released in your body? Are you feeling a certain, like, is there a certain release of dopamine or whatever that would be? But there's got to be some sort of sensation going on currently, and you're trying to maximize that as much as possible through your experience. And so if you stop moving, even if you're not experiencing pain, you've stopped pleasure as motion. You've lost that momentum, and you've got to go back and get it back. And so that's the presentism, is like, because it's evaluated moment by moment, right? It's not evaluated reflectively at the end by people at your funeral.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, what are some of your overall impressions of this philosophy or the chapter? What are some of the
Yeah, I think I'm
takeaways you
impressed.
had?
I think that, like, I think I have a lot of respect for anybody who is internally consistent. That's something that Seneca rails about. And I think that, like, I'm not usually inclined towards hedonism, but I am, like, I do like somebody who's consistent. There's always this concern with Epicureanism that it's like the hedonism of losers. That might be too hard to say, but it's like, oh, what is the best way to get pleasure is like to be virtuous and to, you know,
Yeah,
live
eat
a
plain
calm
bread
life.
and yeah,
Yeah, yeah, have
enjoy
good bread
water.
and soup. Yeah, do labor on your farm, and it's just like it seems a bit like you know. It just seems a bit inconsistent. It seems like, is that really your position? If you really think pleasure is the highest good, it seems to me the position would almost be, yeah, this Aristippus position, which is like, look, you've got to be successful. You've got to have powerful friends. You've got to have the social skills to navigate the situations well. And you've got to have 30 to 40 years of philosophical education so you can do all this without ruining it in a sustainable, playful, self-mastering way. But if you can do that, that's where it's at. And like, I feel bad for you, Diogenes, that you don't have all those cards, but I've clearly got the better life than you. Yeah, I really respect it. I don't agree with it. I think I'm still a stoic. I'm not pulled over, but it's a much more compelling version of hedonism than I've found Epicureanism to be. At least at this first run of it, it's not systematized in the same way, and the quips are always like powerful and motivating. I'm sure Epicurus had some good ones, but that's my first impression. Um, I really like that consistency, and I took a quote here, um, another quip, which was being once asked. So this was Aristippus was asked, "What advantage philosophers have?" He replied, "Should all laws be repealed, we shall go on living as we do now."
Hmm.
And that's that idea of consistency, which is that, like, I live the way I live because I have a personal philosophy. I have a set of things that matter to me, and I'm going to structure my life in pursuit of those things. And whether or not there is a law in place, um, this is an exaggeration to extent, but like, social conventions or laws are not the determining factor for my behavior or my decision making process or my value system. It's my own internal system. That's what I've gained from philosophy. And so, yeah, I really admire that consistency. I think it's a very genuine, authentic portrayal of hedonism. And I think once you add some playfulness to it and you add some willingness to throw your money overboard, it counters a lot of the criticisms of hedonism as well.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think it's consistent. In that consistency, one could say paraphrasing others, lies freedom. So that idea that Aristippus is free because he's not bound by these pleasures. It's just something he chooses to pursue them as he can. And that honestly requires a kind of competence that is cool to see in the chapter, because you don't often think of a hedonist as especially socially competent or skilled. But what you see in Aristippus is like, oh, he needs to be not just sort of philosophically skilled in the sense that he can enjoy the pleasures of or Cartesian without being harmed, but also socially skilled, probably like financially savvy in order to really bring his life together and live the life he wants to lead. So I think that's interesting. This idea of actually, in a sense, hedonism becomes practically demanding. In
Mm-hmm.
this,
Yeah,
for
skilled. It's like a skilled hedonism.
yeah, like do you have what's required to be really successful in this kind of life? It's whereas perhaps other kinds of hedonism might be more egalitarian, or say like anyone can work on their desires. Aristippus, and I think some of the Cyrenaics say that the wise man, most likely he's going to experience pleasure, but it's not guaranteed, which does seem consistent that their wisdom on this account isn't going to guarantee happiness.
Mm-hmm.
But personally, I don't find hedonism sort of as a philosophy, is that the idea of the end of life is pleasure, very plausible. But I do like to see these ideas of self mastery. I think Aristippus himself is just hilarious in a way that's difficult to capture. So I would encourage anyone, if they're able to read the chapter and see what they get from it, and yeah, let us know if you find it useful or entertaining.
Yeah. Another historical part I wanted to call out um, was that he passed his teachings on to his daughter, Arete, which is I'm always looking for these examples of like historical philosophers, and we don't have a lot of her writings, but so she was almost the head of the school for a period of time, if you could call it that. It wasn't formalized into a school, but you had he was just a goofy guy, like he had his ideas, and then he passed those ideas down to his daughter Arte, and then she passed it down to her son, and then he was kind of the next formal head of the school. And then I think did systematize the philosophy according to Diogenes, and kind of write down these ideas and formalize these concepts. But I think it's cool, yeah, it's just as a historical fact to have that lineage that includes a woman as a head of the school in a sense, which is another way of breaking convention, right? Which is probably just thought she was the child most adept at philosophy or the one most inclined towards it. So it's like, why would I not choose her? That's like a social convention, which I thought was cool too, and speaks to that consistency.
Yeah, I think so. You also don't see so many philosophies being a family affair, unless I can
Yeah, that's
think
true
of
too. Family business.
family business. Nice. All right. Well, I think one of my favorite lines from him is, "What would you gain from philosophy?" He replied, "The ability to feel at ease in any society." Do you want to end on any other quips of his, or should we just leave it there?
I think that's great.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Gil.
Thanks for listening to Stoa Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.